Hello everyone. So today we are going to present about trade policy analysis. But before we continue to the presentation, let me introduce our group members. There are Daniel Alexander, putu viola kanno, and me, Valerie fabiolette. Moving on the next slide, there is absolute advantage revisited, and we recall from the chapter 2 that already explained by the other groups. And this, as you can see in this curve, we assume that the demand in two countries are exactly the same, and for the supply conditions in the two countries are such. Vietnam supply curve for rice is farther to the right, as you can see here, and Japan supply curve tend to be in the left. Also in this curve, you can see the autarky price of rice in Vietnam, or PV, is lower than the autarky price of rice in Japan, or PG. And this gives Vietnam an absolute advantage in producing rice. Also there's PW, it is the world price. You can see the world price settles between the two autarky prices. So basically, because Vietnam export rice and Japan import rice, the world price will adjust to ensure that Vietnam's exports are the same as Japan imports. And as you can see, there is a reduction in domestic quantity supplied in Japan. So the first equilibrium point in PJ and SJ is tend to be higher than the equilibrium point in PW and SJ. It is possible that the firms producing rice in Japan would lobby the Japanese government to oppose this decrease in domestic quantity supply, demanding the protection from Vietnam exports. And in the next slide, there is trade policy measure. When a country seeks to grant import protection to a sector of its economy, it can choose among a number of measures that can be broadly classified as either tariff or non-tariff measures. And non-tariff measures, or NTMs, divided into four categories. First, there is tax-like measures. Second is cost-increasing measures. And the third one, quantitative measures. And the last is government procurement practice. A tax-like measures include an anti-dumping or AD duty, and countervailing duty or CVD, also temporary import surcharges, and variable levies. Dumping involves the price of an exported good being lower than the price of the same good in the exporting country, and the AD duties can be applied in certain circumstances when dumping takes place. And for the CVD measures, or the countervail, subsidized by exporters, and again can be applied in certain circumstances. And for the AD and CVD measures are together often referred to as administrative protection, and form a veritable industry of trade policy analysis, spanning national government and trade policy law firms, attempting to assure that trade is fair. And the second one, cost increasing measures. It includes what is known about as standards and technical regulations, or STR, and technical barriers to trade, TBT, sanitary and phytosanitary or SPS requirement, prior import deposit, customs procedure, and reference or minimum import prices. For STR and TBTs are a growing area of trade policy activity and analysis. It is one area where there are clear cases in which increasing protection can improve welfare in instances such as consumer health and safety. However, it is also an area where barriers are put in place simply for their protective effect. And customs procedure is another area that has received increased attention. This is for two reasons. First, there is a concern that slow customs clearance procedures in developing countries can be wasteful. Second, custom clearance particularly can be a real barrier for developing country exporters trying to enter developed country. Consequently, there is concern with capacity building for developing country exporters in this area. And the third one, there is quantitative measures. It is a large group of NTM including import quota, tariff rate quota or TRQ, voluntary export restraints or VER, import licensing, foreign exchange control, sanctions, and embargoes. Also, local or domestic content requirement and import or export balancing requirement. Actually, for many years, import quota were the norm in agriculture, textile, and clothing trade. But this is no longer the case among WTO members, but can still exist in non-member countries. And however, TRQs are still in use in agricultural sector, including the Japanese rice sector. This involves two tariff level. First, a lower tariff for levels of imports within the quota, or we call the within quota tariff, and a higher tariff level of import above the quota, or we call it the out of quota tariff. And finally, the last one, government procurement practices. It concerns the process that government employ in determining their contract procurement and the posture of this contract toward imported goods. So there is a statement that saying the government is the single largest purchaser of goods and services. Based on this statement that this makes the government procurement process and their specific posture toward imports an important matter. So based on my explanation, it is clear that trade policy are numerous, and in this presentation we are going to simplify greatly in this chapter and focus on the basic analysis of a tariff and quota within the absolute advantage framework, which will explain by my friend Daniel and Viola.
Hello everyone, my name is Daniel, so I'm going to continue the presentation. So the last part was trade policy measures, so I'm going to explain the last remaining part of that topic. So first we have quantitative measures, which is a large group of NTMs, including the first one, import quotas, tariff rate quotas or TRQ, voluntary export restraints or VER, import licensing, foreign exchange control, sanction and embargoes, local or domestic content requirements, import or export balancing requirement. Okay, so the next one, the within quota tariff, which is a lower tariff for levels of import within the quota, while the out of quota tariff, it is a higher tariff for levels of import above the quota. Alright, so next I'm going to explain further about tariff. So we have a curve on the right hand side. So PW represents world price, Q as supply, QD demand, and the difference between the demand and supply is import, which is ZJ, which represents Japan. And in this case, it is about the imports of rice from Vietnam to Japan. Now let's suppose that we have tariffs on this scenario, and we have tariff also on that curve right there. So because of the existence of this tariff, it raises the domestic price of an imported product above the road price. In this case, price from PW to PW plus T. In the case of Japanese rice, the domestic price is many times larger than the road price. So because of this increase in the domestic price of rice above the road price, it has a number of effects. So the first one is the expansion of rice production from QS to QS with tariffs. So this expansion is actually what rice farmers had been expecting because they want to gain more because the production is expanding, and so as their production of their rice also from their farm, I mean. So next, the fall of the domestic consumption from the quantity demand to quantity demand with tariffs. Also, the imports fall from ZJ to ZJ tariffs. So because of this, the tariff itself suppressed the relationship between Japan and Vietnam in case of importing. So yeah, there's also a set of welfare and revenue effects that involves Japanese households, firms, and government. So what happens to the consumer? The tariff has caused consumer surplus to fall by area A, B, C, and D because Japanese rice consumers are paying more and consuming less. And what happens to the producer? The producer surplus has increased by the area A because Japanese producers are receiving more for their product and that they produce more to exploit that gain. Next, what happens to the government? Now of course, they receive revenue from the import tax or this tariff. So this is the formula: T times the import tariff or the area C itself. Right, so next about net welfare effect of trade policy. It summarizes the welfare impact of the policy for a country as a whole. So due to this net welfare effect, we have, and the tariff as well, we have this equation right here. So next, okay, so we're moving on to another topic. This is term of trade effects. We have another curve which is different from the previous one. So the main difference is that the world price does not stay constant as the Japanese government places a tariff on the imported rice. So the world price before the tariff is PW. After the tariff exists, so the world price falls to PW with tariff plus T. So the fall of this world price of rice affects the welfare analysis of the tariff. Consumer surplus in Japan falls by A, B, C, and D, and the producer surplus in Japan rises by A. However, though, Japan government revenue is now area C and E. If you remember from the previous topic, the government revenue from the tariff itself is represented by the area C only. So yeah, that's the difference. And then we have another net welfare after with the terms of trade effects like so. Now the net welfare effect of the previous figure and this figure right here, or the equation here, is very different. We have terms of trade gain in area E now in this equation right here and the curve. So because of this, we cannot say whether the tariff hurts welfare in Japan or not. If the world price falls by a lot, E could be very large, even larger than BD. However, though, we should not jump to the conclusion that given a large terms of trade effect, tariffs are good for countries. This is because Vietnam would just probably not sit idly by when Japan imposes a tariff on import of rice. Vietnam could just instead retaliate by imposing another tariff on a product that Japan exports. This tariff would lower the world price of Japan's export good, which would hurt Japan's welfare. Now, that doesn't just stop there. Japan might further retaliate in return. So, this is often known as trade war. Now, to prevent such trade wars, we have General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, or GATT, and also known as World Trade Organization, or WTO right now. So, yeah, so that's the explanation of tariffs and in terms of trade effects. Okay, so thank you very much for watching my presentation. Goodbye.
Everybody, my name is putu, and I'm going to explain the next part about quota. So what is quota? Quota is a quantitative restriction on imports and one important type of non-tariff measures or NTM. So for example, when the Japanese government imposes a quota on the rice imports, they say to all of the rice exporters and domestic importers that they limit the amount, they only allow a certain amount. As you can see in the next slide, this is the graph. So we know that before Japanese did the quota, the rice imports are ZJ, which is this Z, ZJ equals the QD. QD is the Japanese consumer demand, and the QS is the Japanese suppliers. So the before quota, the equation is QD minus QS. And for example, for the political economy trade reasons, the Japanese government is not satisfied with the before outcome, right? So they restrict the imports into a smaller amount until it results in the ZJ quota, which is this. The equation for the after the quota is ZJ quota equals the QD quota minus the QS quota. So these changes from ZJ, which is this part, to ZJ quota, which is this part, this these changes caused the shortage of rice in Japan compared to the beginning situation. So it results in the domestic price of rice in Japan rises from the P, PW to the P quota. These two different prices is known as the quota premium. So same with the case in before, which is the tariff. The consumer surplus will falls by the area A, B, C, D, and for the producer surplus, it will increase by the area A. So next, the quota policy is typically administered via a system of import licenses. It affects in the restriction of the supply of import licenses in the world. So the area C, let me clear this. So the area C represents the extra value of the right to import amount of ZJ quota. This part is known as the quota rents. So there are two common possibilities. The first is import licenses are allocated to domestic importers or for the Japanese. In the area C, it's a loss to consumers and gain for the importers. So the country of Japan actually gained something. So the next possibilities is import licenses are allocated for foreign exporters, which is the Vietnamese. So for this allocation for foreign exporters, the area C is a transfer from the domestic consumers to these foreign exporters. So it results in a loss to the country of Japan. So next, if we suppose that we are the government official that is administering the quota policy, which of these two alternatives will we choose? Is it the first one, which is the quota allocated to domestic importers, or we allocate two quota, or we allocate two foreign exporters? Of course, we will choose the first one, which is we allocated to the domestic importers because they have a smaller welfare loss. But when the quota is in active use, many governments choose a foreign allocated quota. So why is that? So there are two possibilities. The first is they were uninformed about the economics implication of their choices, or the second possibility is the political considerations cause this choice. So next is comparative advantage models. The analysis of trade policies in this chapter has been based on absolute advantage. So we have shown that how we can examine the trade policies to make estimates of production, consumption, trade, employment, and welfare impacts. But in some cases, these effects of trade policies go beyond a single sector. And for those cases, trade policy turn to models of comparative advantage. This comparative advantage model analyzes more than one sector simultaneously. For example, in the previous case is rice and motorcycles. And these models are much more complicated than the absolute advantage. But we need to be careful because the comparative advantage approach includes the fact that a protective measure in one sector acts as a implicit tax on production in other sectors. So it can result in reducing their output levels. So from this chapter, we can conclude that in order to help protect the losers of increased international trade, most of the countries in the world engage in trade policies. The supply and demand analysis of the absolute advantage model allows us to discover the effects of trade policies on the production, consumption, trade, welfare, and the employment. So, in general, the intervention in free trade reduces the overall welfare of the country intervening. However, certain groups might benefit from these policies, which is why they are actually implemented. I think that is all from us. Thank you.